Welcome to the final part in the series We Are the Movement and our journey through the book of Acts. Over the past 23 sessions, we've followed the story of how a small group of 120 believers huddled in an upper room have transformed into a movement that swept across the Roman world and carried with it the message of faith, hope and love that has the power to transform from the inside out. As the movement has grown, we've witnessed tragedy and triumph as the clash of kingdoms has played out in cities all across the Mediterranean. Wherever the movement has spread and the message is shared, the kingdom of heaven has advanced, but never without opposition. In every port, town, city, in every marketplace, public square, synagogue or temple, in the hearts of every man and woman who have heard this message, a battle has raged. And in the face of persecution, of riots and false accusations, despite beatings and shipwrecks and supernatural opposition, and at the cost of losing homes, friends and family, and sometimes even life itself, the members of this movement have inch by inch, house by house, street by street, faithfully carried the good news that reconciliation with God is at hand from Jerusalem to Judea and Samaria and into the very ends of the earth. And today, though this may be the end of our series going through this book of Acts, it's not the end of the story. Today the movement still advances, the same message is still shared, and though the outcome of the war may be settled, there are still battles to be won. We conclude our look back at those who laid the groundwork for the movement we now advance with a look at Acts chapter 28. Now you may recall that the last chapter ended in dramatic fashion as we travelled with the Apostle Paul and his companions upon a ship that was bound for Rome. As that ship sailed along the shore of Crete, a great wind blew up and a hurricane engulfed the boat. For 14 days, the boat and the 276 sailors, soldiers, travellers and prisoners were tossed about on the waves, blown about amidst a starless void of ocean. And when all seemed lost, it was the apostle whose voice once more brought hope to the hopeless. He reassured them all that though the ship may be lost, that their lives would be saved. And as the ship ran aground and splintered on the rocks, men dived into the sea and swam for shore, or clambered to take hold of wreckage and floated to safety. And as chapter 27 closed out, all 276 of them reached the safety of the sands of an unknown island. That's where we pick up the story today and conclude our look through this series with chapter 28. Let's read now from verse 1. After we were brought safely through, we learned that the island was called Malta. The native people showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and welcomed us all because it had begun to rain and was cold. When Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out and because of the heat and fastened on his hand. When the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "No doubt this man is a murderer. That he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." He, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. They were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But when they had waited a long time and saw no misfortune come to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. So Paul and the rest of the party arrive on the shores of Malta, and Luke remarks that they were showed unusual kindness by the locals. They kindled a fire and welcomed them all because it had begun to rain and it was cold. And it could well have been that this was not the kind of reception that they may have anticipated. As strangers washing up on the beach of an unknown island and in the company of Roman soldiers, Luke perhaps thought they would not be so welcome. And even today, the people of Malta have a reputation for being particularly hospitable and welcoming. It's a characteristic trait of the Maltese culture that seems to have persisted down through the centuries. We're told that the locals welcomed the shipwrecked victims in by lighting a fire. And then we're told that Paul had gone off to gather a bundle of sticks because, of course, if there's a fire, there's a need to supply it with fuel to keep that fire burning. And it's interesting to see that Paul is the one out gathering sticks. Yes, others may have been doing this as well, but it's characteristic of Paul that he would be doing this. It seems like, given everything that has happened, given the fact that he was the one who took the lead on the boat, he was the voice they listened to, he would have had the opportunity to exert the authority he gained through his successful prophecy of the ship being wrecked but every life being spared, to not have to be the one who goes out gathering sticks. He could have said, "You go gather up the sticks," but instead Paul chose to serve the others. He chose to get up, to go off into the cold and gather the sticks himself. Paul, I think, understood that the biblical model of authority isn't about saying to others, go here and do that, or exercising that authority for one's own gain or benefit, but about serving others. Authority as a Christian is never about exerting ourselves into a situation. It's about exerting God and his kingdom into a situation. It's about perceiving what God is saying and doing in a moment and translating that to the people around you so that looking to you, they will see heaven made manifest. This is what Jesus meant when he said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. He operated in a way that demonstrated the heart of God. He operated in the will of God. And when you operate in the will of God, you are operating in alignment with the ultimate authority. And here is Paul demonstrating not only his humility, but also God's desire to care for people. But interestingly, as Paul does this, we're told that one of the sticks Paul ends up coming back with isn't actually a stick, it's a snake. And this snake, or a viper as it's called here, the Greek word is echidna, which directly indicates it's a poisonous snake, is the same word Jesus uses to describe the Pharisees and the hypocrites in Matthew 23. And now what happens next is interesting from both Paul's perspective, but also from the natives' perspectives. So when the natives see this happening, they say, no doubt this man is a murderer. Though he escaped the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. And there are a number of interesting things in this statement. Firstly, depending on the translation you are reading, the word justice here may or may not be capitalized, or your translation may read, the goddess justice has not allowed him to live. And that is an accurate translation because when the natives said justice, they aren't referring to a concept, but to the goddess they worship, the goddess Dike, the goddess of justice. Their assumption then is that Paul has done something evil and he is deserving of punishment. And not only deserving of it, but that he will be punished. The natives believed that those who'd done wrong would be punished by the gods for what they'd done. And in that sense, they were correct. Their consciences testified to them that wrong deeds were justly deserving of punishment. They understood this without needing explanation. And this is kind of what Paul writes about in Romans 1 when he says in verse 19, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. We all have an inbuilt understanding of right and wrong because God has hardwired that into each of us. And one day we each will have to give an account of our decisions and actions to God. So when this viper fastened itself onto Paul, the people see it and believe this is the gods exercising just punishment for some misdeed Paul must have committed. But when Paul shakes the thing off, nothing happens, and they're expecting his hand to swell up, expecting him to fall down, collapse and die. They presumably had witnessed this happen to other people before, but this time nothing happens. And when you read this, Paul seems to be the calmest man in the whole gathering. How can he be so calm? He is living his life on the promise of God. God has not only promised him that he must go to Rome and testify there about him, but Jesus also spoke these words in Luke 10:19. Behold, I have given you authority to tread on serpents and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall hurt you. Paul, I think, understood that he was under the protection of Jesus. That didn't give him license to go out and start picking up snakes willy-nilly, nor does this passage mean that we should bring snakes into a church service and put God to the test over this word. But it did give Paul confidence that his mission would not be denied even through this potentially fatal encounter. And when the natives see this, they see Paul being bitten by what they know to be a poisonous snake, and then they see that nothing happens to him. They change their mind about what Paul may have done and instead begin to say that he's not a murderer, he's a god. And this makes sense given what we've already understood about these people. They believed that if someone had done something bad, they would be judged for it by the gods. Those were the rules they understood. Those were the rules they were subject to. And when nothing happens to Paul, they see he was subject to a different set of rules. And to them, the only people who get to play by a different set of rules are the gods. And while the natives may have misinterpreted this and called Paul a god, we know that in many ways, Paul was subject to a different set of rules. His arrival on the island heralds the arrival of a new power. New rules are now in play, and God is declaring that he is now the one who holds sway in this place. It's no longer the goddess Dike who is setting the agenda, no longer the rules of her kingdom that apply, but with the arrival of Paul and his companions, a new kingdom. The kingdom of heaven is now setting the agenda. Now, interestingly, there's no record in the text here of Paul correcting them when they call him a god, but at this point, I believe Luke is taking for granted the fact that we have gotten to know Paul pretty well through his account. We remember the time that he and Barnabas were hailed as gods in Lystra in Acts 14 and how they tore their clothes and rebuked the people. No doubt Paul corrected these people, and no doubt Paul too shared the gospel with them. We've seen throughout the book of Acts that where Paul and the other apostles have gone, signs and wonders have followed to confirm the message they shared. And within hours of washing up on this beach, another sign is recorded for us, a sign that no doubt opened the door for the message Paul surely shared to be received by these people. And as we keep reading, we see this pattern continue. Let's read from verse 7. There was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us to his home and showed us generous hospitality for 3 days. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him and, after prayer, placed his hands on him and healed him. When this had happened, the rest of the sick of the island came and were cured. They honored us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with the supplies we needed. Again, we see the signs follow Paul. He prays for the father of the official who recovers from what would have been a death sentence. Without the benefit of modern medicine, fever and dysentery in those days would almost certainly have claimed the life of this man. And as this happens, we're told that the rest of the sick on the island come and were cured. And this is a wonderful illustration of what happens when we share our testimonies, because the only reason these people came was because they heard what had happened to this man. Either he or the members of his household must have shared the news around the island, and over the course of the next 3 days, Paul ministers to all the sick people who come to him at the estate of Publius, who must have been a very wealthy man to be so generous to 276 others to put them up for 3 days. And the news of what God has done through Paul to this man must have spread across the island like wildfire. And you can see the strategic hand of God in this. It wasn't just a random member of the population, but the father of the chief official who was healed. A man who would have been held in high regard. The father of the most influential man in the area. It's like a key that turns in the lock and opens a door. And in 3 days, sickness is eliminated from this island. And again, we're not explicitly told that Paul shared the gospel here, but we know enough about the man, about his character and his determination and his temperament, that there is no doubt that he shared the message as passionately as he always did. The healings are signs. They point to the message. They confirm the authenticity of the message. If the signs were there, the message surely followed. And though it is by no means certain, church tradition tells us that a church was established on the island during the time of Paul's visit, and it names the bishop of that church as none other than Publius himself. Though we don't know if this was true or whether it can be testified to in history, it's almost certain that the island was hugely impacted by the events that took place here. Again, we see God's hand moving in the middle of a situation that came about through catastrophe. The storm that dashed the ship on the rocks was the same storm that brought Paul and the movement to the shores of Malta. And even in the middle of a situation that seemed to spell disaster, God delivered not only the men on the ship, but the very island itself. Even in the middle of a disaster, God's purpose cannot be thwarted. Even when it looks like everything is going wrong, he is working all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purposes. There is no storm strong enough, no night dark enough, no situation dire enough to stop him from bringing to pass that which he has decreed. Let's keep reading now from verse 11. After 3 months, we set sail in a ship that had wintered in the island, a ship of Alexandria with the twin gods as a figurehead. Putting in at Syracuse, we stayed there for 3 days, and from there we made a circuit and arrived at Rhegium. And after 1 day, a south wind sprang up, and on the second day we arrived at Puteoli. There we found brothers and were invited to stay with them for 7 days, and so we came to Rome. And the brothers there, when they heard about us, came as far as the Forum of Appius and the 3 taverns to meet us. On seeing them, Paul thanked God and took courage. And when we came to Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier who guarded him. So finally, after 3 months in Malta, passage on another boat is secured by Paul's Roman escort. on this ship from Alexandria, which had the figurehead of the twin gods. And this is Castor and Pollux, twin brothers fathered by Zeus according to Greek mythology, known in Latin as the Gemini. They were the patron saints of sailors, hence why they appear on this boat. From Malta, the travellers set sail for Syracuse on Sicily, where they have a brief 3-day stopover. And while Luke doesn't record any details of that stay, church tradition again tells us that in those 3 days, Paul planted another church. From there, they sailed on to Rhegium, which is on the very southern tip of mainland Italy, before sailing northwards, blown by the southern wind, Puteoli, which is in the Bay of Naples. Here they disembarked from the ships, but before making the final journey overland to Rome, they stayed for a week with some believers in the area. After 7 days, they leave Puteoli and head to Rome. And Luke simply writes, "And so we came to Rome." But the significance of this moment is not lost on us, as we've tracked the journey of the movement that started in a room in Jerusalem and expanded across Judea and Samaria, over into Asia Minor and across the Mediterranean. This simple phrase, "and so we came to Rome," marks the culmination of the words Jesus spoke at the start of the account, where he said, "You shall be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the very ends of the earth." There's an old saying that says all roads lead to Rome. And this is the road the movement and the Apostle Paul in particular have been on since the journey began. Rome marked the centre of the known world, the seat of power. And if all roads lead to Rome, then all roads lead from Rome. Paul knew and understood that. In Rome, the movement and the message would find a launch pad that would take them across the entire world. And so they came to Rome. And we're told that as they neared Rome, at the Forum of Appius, believers living in Rome came out to meet Paul and welcome him in. Now, the Forum of Appius was some 43 miles south of Rome, and this was a journey of at least 2 days. And these believers, in hearing that Paul, the man who had written the most theologically rich letter to these very people, was on his way to them up the Via Appia to come to Rome, journeyed out to greet him and welcome him in. And Luke records that their arrival brought Paul courage. After all he'd been through to get there, and let's not forget, still a prisoner awaiting trial that could potentially cost him his life, seeing these men come and greet him was like a tonic to his soul. It strengthened and encouraged him to press forward into the seat of empire itself. And Luke records that when Paul arrived, he was allowed to stay by himself in a house with a soldier to guard him. Now, these soldiers who were guarding him, they weren't any old soldiers, they were the Praetorian guards of the emperor himself. Now let's remember that, because we'll come back to it in a moment. But for now, let's read a little more from verse 17. After 3 days, he called together the local leaders of the Jews. And when they'd gathered, he said to them, "Brothers, though I had done nothing against our people or the customs or our fathers, yet I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans. When they had examined me, they wished to set me at liberty, because there was no reason for the death penalty in my case. But because the Jews objected, I was compelled to appeal to Caesar, though I had no charge to bring against my nation. For this reason, therefore, I have asked to see you and speak with you, since it is because of the hope of Israel that I am wearing this chain." And they said to him, "We've received no letters from Judea about you, and none of the brothers coming here has reported or spoken any evil about you. But we desire to hear from you what your views are, for with regard to the sect, we know that everywhere it is spoken against." When they had appointed a day for him, they came to him at his lodging in great numbers. From morning till evening, he expounded to them, testifying to the kingdom of God and trying to convince them about Jesus, both from the law of Moses and from the prophets. And some were convinced by what he said, but others disbelieved. And disagreeing among themselves, they departed after Paul had made one statement. "The Holy Spirit was right in saying to your fathers through Isaiah the prophet, 'Go to this people and say, you will indeed hear, but never understand. And you will indeed see, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull. And with their ears they can barely hear, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them. Therefore, let it be known to you that this salvation of God has been sent to the Gentiles. They will listen.'" So, after arriving in Rome, Paul rests for 3 days. Just 3 days after everything he's been through. 3 days is all it takes for him to get up and get about his business in the city. And this speaks again to the character of the man and the sense of mission and co-mission he must have felt. He was here to do one thing, to spread the message, to share the gospel. And Paul starts in the same place he always starts. He goes to the Jews living in the city. As he wrote to the believers living in Rome, the gospel came first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. This has been his modus operandi through his ministry, and he isn't going to change it now. Paul sends an invitation to the Jews of the city to come and to listen to him. In fact, he doesn't want them just to listen, but to also present his defense to them against the charges that have led to his arrival in Rome as a prisoner. And when the Jews gather, Paul begins by telling them exactly why it is that he's here. He says, I've done nothing wrong. I haven't spoken against the customs of our people, nor have I any ill will against my own people, but it is because the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem insisted that I be put to death that I had to make this appeal to Caesar. And he goes on to say, this is why I asked to speak to you, because of the hope of Israel. And what's the hope of Israel? It's the Messiah, the promised one, the one who would come and deliver and save. And Paul is saying, that is why I've asked to talk to you today. This is what I want to tell you about. I've met him. He was dead, but he was raised to life. Jesus is the hope of Israel, the one God promised through the ages, down through the line of Abraham. The one we've been looking forward to all this time is here. And the Jews reply, we haven't heard anything from Jerusalem. No letters, no visitors. But what we do know is that this sect, these Christians, have a bad name everywhere we go. And at this point, we do well to remember that the vast majority of the Jews listening to Paul here have most likely spent some of the time over the last decade in exile from Rome, as Paul's friends Priscilla and Aquila did, following the Jewish expulsion from Rome in AD 49 under the Emperor Claudius. During that time, they, like Priscilla and Aquila, would have been dispersed to other locations around the empire and heard and perhaps seen the effects of the spread of Christianity. And upon returning to Rome, sometime around AD 53, when the expulsion order expires, these Jews may well have shared their experiences from across the empire with one another. And so their own impression of the Christian sect, as they called it, was almost certainly a negative one. But even into this context, we see that Paul begins to share the message. They come to him in great numbers to hear what he has to say. And as Paul shares the message, that some believe and some don't. It's the same pattern we've witnessed all through Paul's ministry and all through the book of Acts. Some believe, others don't. And then we're told that there was disagreement among them and that they left Paul when he made one crucial reference. He quotes Isaiah chapter 6 verses 9 and 10, and he says that even though the Jews have seen and heard, they do not believe, and that now the message was going to the Gentiles who would believe. And this is the point the Jews depart and leave him. And this again continues the pattern we've seen throughout Paul's ministry. So many times when he has shared this message with the Jews, it hasn't been until the introduction of the Gentiles into the argument that things take a turn for the worse and often get violent. There is a cultural response right across the Jewish communities, scattered across Asia and Europe, that when salvation is mentioned in connection with the Gentiles, they immediately turn off and often turn violent. And this again demonstrates that they had missed the point of them being a special nation. You see, God had chosen and created through Abraham a people to be his own special possession, his own portion from among all the peoples of the earth. The Israelites weren't chosen because they were special. They were chosen for a special task. They were to be a light to the nations and a witness to the Gentiles. Exodus 19, 5-6 says, now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The Israelites were supposed to be a kingdom of priests, God's chosen people to carry God's message to the whole of the earth. To all the other nations, God was intent on winning back to himself. This was their role, but they missed it and became obsessed with their distinction between them and the unclean Gentile world. Yes, they were supposed to be different, but they were different for purpose, to call the rest of the world to God, not to separate themselves as superior from the rest of the world. And Paul's quotation of this scripture is a challenge to every Jewish listener in his audience, challenging them that with the plan of God. And time again, we've seen the Jews would not listen to a message that offered salvation to the Gentiles, even though this was their mission as God's kingdom of priests all along. So Paul does what he has done countless times before. He takes his message to the Gentiles, never giving up on the Jews, but now opening the door to those who would have hearts to understand. And Luke rounds out his account of the Acts of Apostles by telling us this. In verse 30 he says, "He lived there for 2 whole years at his own expense and welcomed by all who came to him, proclaiming the kingdom of God and teaching about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance." Paul spends the next 2 years in Rome sharing the message and proclaiming the kingdom of God. And this abrupt end to the book of Acts leaves us with a few questions, as perhaps Luke meant it to. We're given little detail here about Paul's activities for those 2 years. However, we know that in this time he likely wrote a number of his letters. His letter to the Ephesians, Philippians, and probably also Colossians and Philemon. And it's to the book of Philippians that I just want to turn quickly, where Paul, from his house arrest, chained, you remember, to those Praetorian guards who took it in turns to guard him night and day, wrote these words. "I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole Imperial Guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear." Paul was able, from his house arrest, to write to the church in Philippi and to tell them that even this imprisonment was furthering the spread of the gospel. Even among the Imperial Guard, the Praetorian Guard themselves, the very household of Caesar. God is once again demonstrating that even when the situation seems to be at its worst, he is well able to work it for his own glory. Even when the enemy locks Paul up and seeks to keep him confined, the gospel is spread. And far from Paul being locked up with the guards are locked up with Paul, a captive audience, to which Paul preaches the gospel and testifies that some of the guards, perhaps all of them, have come to know that he is here for this purpose. And not only this, but the knock-on effect has been to embolden the other Christians in Rome and for them to speak all the more, to share the gospel without fear. And no doubt in this time, even with the apostle in chains, the church in Rome must have exploded with growth. Now Luke doesn't tell us what happened to Paul, nor is his fate recorded anywhere else in Scripture, so we must turn instead to other sources. Historians and early church writers, they tell us that Paul's eventual fate was to be beheaded at the order of the Emperor Nero, sometime between the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64 and the end of Nero's reign in AD 68. Most of the scholars opt for an earlier date, 64 or 65. In addition, most scholars note that Peter also met his end in AD 67 at the hands of the Emperor Nero. But what Luke records for us here happens in AD 60 or 61, meaning that after these 2 years, we're told he stays in Rome. We likely have a gap of 2 to 5 years where Paul continued to be active. It's unlikely that he remained a prisoner during this time, and the evidence from his letters to Timothy and Titus, as well as the writings from early church fathers, suggests he left Rome, presumably after being acquitted, and was later rearrested and brought back to Rome for his execution. So the question becomes, where did Paul go? What did he do during this time between the end of Luke's account in Acts, which takes us to AD 62 and 63, and his death some 2 to 5 years later? Well, the most likely next destination for Paul, I believe, wasn't going back to Ephesus or Corinth or Crete, even though he intimated that he was anticipating doing so during his letter to Philemon. But instead, his first destination after leaving Rome was probably Spain. We know from his earlier writings to the church in Rome that Paul's desire was to go to Spain after he had spent time in Rome. In addition to that, the early church father Clement, who was held to be a disciple of the apostle Peter, wrote in around AD 95 that Paul had preached in the east and the west. He won the genuine glory for his faith, having taught righteousness to the whole world and having reached the farthest limits of the west. This gives us reason to believe that Paul's first heading after leaving Rome in around AD 62 or 63 was west and not east, to head, as he always planned to Spain. And given the distance between Spain and Italy, it's safe to assume that Paul probably stayed here for some time before heading back east and possibly to the island of Crete, where he worked alongside Titus to establish the churches there before departing. From here, it becomes increasingly difficult to trace Paul's possible steps, but it's likely he headed to Ephesus, where he reunited with his spiritual son Timothy, and where he also encountered opposition from Alexander the coppersmith, fell out with other believers in Asia, but received aid from a man called Onesiphorus, a man who would later seek him out upon his re-imprisonment in Rome. From here, we know almost nothing about the order of events that occur, only that Paul was likely in a few other locations, including Miletus, Troas, Corinth, as well as possibly Philippi and Thessalonica, and at some point he's rearrested, taken back to Rome and eventually beheaded there, suffering the same fate as every other apostle with the possible exception of John, in becoming a martyr for Jesus. And this really is the only fitting end for a man like Paul, a man who had had his life turned upside down when he met Jesus, who had gone from the most vicious enemy of Christ to his most devoted servant. Everywhere he had gone, he had met opposition and suffered for the message, but his letters came to form half of the New Testament and his legacy endures today. The movement that he helped establish, along with the other apostles, believers and witnesses, has not only endured but has flourished for 2,000 years. And today, as we close our look at this great book, at the account of how men and women stepped out in faith against opposition to see the kingdom of God advance and the good news of the gospel spread across the nations, we can look at Luke's abrupt finale of the book, not as a close to the story, but as an invitation to his readers to see the story continue. The fact is that for nearly 2,000 years, the story recorded in this book has carried on being written in the lives of men, women and children across the continents and down through the ages. The movement that carries the message of the good news of reconciliation with God through Jesus Christ, despite the best efforts of the enemy and the worst flaws of mankind, has never diminished, never wavered, never been extinguished. This movement has passed from generation to generation as each new age, sons and daughters of God have arisen to carry the torch. Though it has cost them, though it doesn't come easy, though the price may at times have included their very lives, these men and women have handed on the baton and the banner to those who would come after. And today, this baton passes to us. The movement now lies within our hands. We get to decide whether the movement advances and how it gets passed on to those who come next. We are the church that Jesus promised to build. You and I today, we each have received the same call. We today are his witnesses, from Jerusalem to Judea and Samaria and to the very ends of the earth. Today, we are the movement. This is our moment. It is our time to arise and shine. In all of time, God marked out this day and called it today. And for this day, he called you. He chose you to be the one who today would carry this movement on, would carry it forward. He called you to advance the kingdom inch by inch and moment by moment. In every conversation, in every interaction, every decision, we have an opportunity to seize the moments that together form the movement that makes earth look more like heaven. What the apostles began 2,000 years ago continues today. As we close our look back, let's in turn look forward and let's allow God to write his story through our lives. Today, we are the movement.